7 months from now, Do-hyun Shin will stand in front of his family's entire board, holding a pen that could hand him everything he's ever worked for. He won't get to use it, because a woman he once accused of betraying him is about to walk through those doors, carrying proof of what his family did 6 years earlier, when newborn Jaiwoo's inheritance was secretly stolen from him. But that's later. Right now, none of that has happened yet. Right now, there's just a woman named Zuri Williams, sitting alone in a small studio in Seoul, staring at an email that says her biggest client just walked away. If you're new here, subscribe to Afro K Storyverse, like this video, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Zuri read the email twice. We've decided to move forward with another vendor for the Han wedding. Thank you for your proposal. 14 words. No explanation. She'd spent 3 weeks on that proposal, mood boards, a full floral concept, a lighting plan she'd redrawn twice because the venue kept changing its mind about the ceiling height. She closed the laptop because reading it a third time wasn't going to change the number in her bank account. Her event design studio had been open 2 years. She'd built it from nothing, no family money, no connections, just an eye for making a room feel like it mattered, and the stubbornness to keep showing up after the first few clients tried to talk her price down to nothing. For a while, it had worked. She'd had 3 staff at one point, a waitlist, even magazine coverage for a rooftop wedding that still made her proud when she scrolled past the photos. Now it was just her and Myra, her one remaining assistant, and even that felt like it was on borrowed time. The studio was small, tucked above a flower shop on a street that smelled like peonies every morning, whether she wanted it to or not. Mood boards covered every wall. A couch in the corner doubled as a place to sleep when a deadline demanded it, which lately was most weeks. It had felt like a beginning once. Tonight it felt like something she was watching slip through her hands, one cancelled contract at a time. Myra had already gone home. Zuri locked up alone, later than she meant to, and walked back through streets that had gone quiet enough to hear her own footsteps. Her apartment was small, tidy, the kind of place that looked like nobody actually lived there if you didn't look closely. Boxes were stacked against the far wall, her mother's things, moved here after the funeral 2 years ago and never fully unpacked. She'd told herself, at the time, that she just hadn't had the space to deal with it yet. Then she told herself she was too busy building the studio. Then she stopped telling herself reasons at all and just let the boxes become part of the furniture, the way grief sometimes settles into a room and stops looking like grief and starts looking like clutter you've decided not to deal with. She made tea she didn't drink. She sat at her small kitchen table with her laptop open again, running numbers that didn't get better no matter which order she added them in. Rent. Myra's back pay. The studio lease renewal in 6 weeks that she currently had no way to cover. Her rent notice sat on the counter, unresolved, the paper starting to curl at the corner from where she kept picking it up and putting it back down. She went to bed without a plan. The plan arrived the next morning as an unfamiliar number. Referral from a former client. The message read, "Private family, exclusive anniversary celebration, flexible budget." Interested in discussing, Zuri sat up straighter than the message probably warranted. Flexible budget wasn't a phrase she heard often anymore. She wrote back immediately, then made herself wait a full hour before checking her phone again, because looking desperate wasn't a strategy she could afford to abandon on top of everything else. The reply came with a name attached, Shin. She didn't place it immediately. Seoul had a lot of powerful families, and Zuri had spent 2 years learning to tell the difference between the ones who paid on time and the ones who thought paying at all was a favor they were doing you. But when she searched further, the holding companies, the tower with the family name carved into stone above the entrance, the quiet, almost bored way business articles referred to them, like everyone already knew who they were and didn't need reminding, her stomach tightened. This wasn't just money. This was the kind of name that made headlines without trying. She thought about the boxes against her wall. She thought about Myra, who hadn't complained once about the late paycheck, which somehow made it worse than if she had. She wrote back and said yes before she could talk herself out of it. Across the city, in a boardroom that carried his family's name in brushed steel letters on the wall behind him, Do-hyun Shin was being told again that his personal life had become a business problem. Board wants stability, his aunt said. Hyrin had a way of making instructions sound like suggestions and a way of making refusals sound like mistakes she was too polite to point out directly. A man who won't commit to anything doesn't inspire confidence, not before a succession vote, not with 3 board seats already leaning toward delay. Run this company for 6 years without a wife, Do-hyun said. Nothing about that has changed. The succession vote has changed. His grandmother said nothing yet. She rarely needed to. When she finally spoke from the head of the table, the room quieted on its own, the way rooms did around her without her ever having to raise her voice. You don't have to marry for love, she said, but you do have to show this family you're not standing alone. People don't hand power to men who look like they have nothing left to lose. I have plenty to lose, Do-hyun said. This company, for one. Company isn't a life, Do-hyun. The board knows the difference, even if you've decided not to. Do-hyun didn't answer that. He'd learned a long time ago that some silences did more work than arguments, that a man who explained himself too often taught the people around him that he could be talked into things, and he'd built the last 6 years of his life on making sure no one thought that about him. Later, alone in his office, he found 6-year-old Jae-woo sitting outside the door, small against the enormous hallway, waiting without saying why. Jae-woo did this sometimes. Showed up, said nothing, just needed to know someone was close, in a house full of people who loved him and still somehow left him alone more often than any of them meant to. Do-hyun sat down beside him on the floor, still in his suit, because standing over him never worked. He'd learned that the hard way, back when Jae-woo was smaller, and every attempt at comfort from a great height only made him shrink further into himself. Bad day? Do-hyun asked. Jae-woo shrugged, which from him was practically a paragraph. Do-hyun didn't push. He'd learned that questions worked on Jae-woo like traps. The boy answered them the way you'd answer someone you didn't fully trust, careful and clipped, giving away only what he had to. So Do-hyun just stayed there, quiet, until Jae-woo leaned into his shoulder, the two of them sitting together in a hallway too big for either of them. Some things, Do-hyun thought, you couldn't fix with a contract, a company, or 6 years of careful control. He had no idea yet how wrong that would turn out to be. The Shin estate was the kind of place that made people lower their voices without being told to. Zuri stood in the entrance hall a full 10 seconds before making herself keep walking. Marble floors that seemed to swallow sound entirely. Ceilings built for a different scale of person. Staff who moved like they'd rehearsed it, quick, silent, already anticipating what she'd need before she thought to ask for it. She reminded herself she was here to do a job. Walk the space. Take notes. Don't be impressed by chandeliers that probably cost more than her studio's entire annual revenue. That resolve lasted until she met him. He walked in mid-conversation with someone else, already correcting a seating detail she hadn't even finished sketching yet. His voice carrying the particular authority of someone who'd never once had to raise it to be obeyed. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. The room had gone slightly more formal the second he entered, staff straightening without seeming to notice they'd done it. The designer, he said, not a question. And the designer with a name, Zuri said. Zuri Williams. Something flickered across his face. Not quite a smile. Do-hyun Shin, I know who you are. Everyone in this building made sure of that before I finished my coffee this morning. That got a reaction, small, involuntary, gone almost as fast as it arrived. Not what I expected, he said. Exactly what I expected, Zuri said. So I think I'm ahead. He didn't answer that. He just watched her a beat longer than the conversation required, like he was recalculating something, and then he walked away without another word. Zuri told herself it didn't mean anything. She went back to the flowers. She was still arranging them an hour later, humming without noticing she was doing it. An old, quiet melody her mother used to hum while she cooked, years and years ago, back when Zuri was small enough to sit on the kitchen counter and watch. Zuri didn't think about it. It was just there, the way old songs are, worn smooth from repetition until they stop feeling like songs at all and start feeling like breathing. She didn't hear the small footsteps until they stopped right behind her. She turned around. A little boy stared up at her, dark eyes, careful and unreadable in a way that seemed too old for 6. Hi, Zuri said, crouching slightly to his height without thinking about it. He didn't answer. He reached up and took her hand. Across the ballroom, a staff member froze mid-step, a tray tilting dangerously in her grip. Somewhere behind Zuri, a chair scraped back too fast. He doesn't do that, someone said quietly, like it needed explaining. He doesn't do that with anyone. Do-hyun was already crossing the room, faster than the moment seemed to call for, his expression somewhere between alarm and something he didn't have a name for yet. Jae-woo. His voice was careful, controlled in a way that clearly wasn't usually a struggle, and today obviously was. "Come here." Daewoo didn't let go. "It's all right," Zuri said, more to the room than to him. "I don't mind." An older woman had appeared at the edge of the ballroom, silver-haired, upright, dressed like she'd stepped out of the wedding photo of some earlier decade, watching the two of them with an expression Zuri couldn't place at first. Then she placed it. It was fear. "What is that song?" the woman said, not loudly, barely a question at all. Zuri blinked, straightening. "I'm sorry, the song, you were humming it." I don't know its name, honestly. My mother used to sing it. I've hummed it my whole life. I don't even think about it anymore." Woman's face had gone pale in a way makeup couldn't quite cover, her hand rising briefly to the collar of her dress like she needed something to hold on to. "Who taught your mother that song?" "I don't know," Zuri said again, feeling like she'd started failing a test she hadn't known she was taking. "Is something wrong?" Do-hyun looked between his grandmother and Zuri, and for the first time all day, he looked less like a man in control of the room and more like one who just realized he wasn't. "Grandmother," he said carefully. "What is it?" She didn't answer him. She was still looking at Zuri, the way you look at someone who's just said something impossible in a perfectly ordinary voice, like the ground had shifted slightly and only she had felt it. A younger woman near the doorway, early 30s, watching with more curiosity than alarm, caught Do-hyun's eye and gave the smallest shake of her head, a silent "I don't know either." Soo-jin, Zuri would learn her name later, filed the moment away the way people do when they sense a story is starting without yet knowing its shape. "Stay," the older woman said finally, "through the event. I want you here a little longer." It wasn't a request. Zuri understood that the same way she'd understood, from the moment she'd walked into this house, that very little here was ever really optional. She said yes anyway. Daewoo, still holding her hand, finally let go satisfied, it seemed, by whatever unspoken thing had just been decided. Zuri had no idea yet what she'd just agreed to. Do-hyun didn't like unanswered questions, especially not ones involving his own family. So the next morning, before the event even began, he had someone quietly pull together a background check on Zuri Williams, not the kind hotels ran on vendors, but the kind his family ran on anyone who got close enough to matter. It came back almost disappointingly clean. No family ties to Seoul's elite. No connections to anyone he knew, no old debts, no old scandals, nothing that explained the way his grandmother's hands had shaken in the ballroom. A small business, 2 years old, more heart than capital behind it. A modest apartment. An assistant who'd been paid late 3 months running and hadn't quit anyway. And then, near the bottom, one line that didn't fit with the rest. Her mother, Evelyn Williams, had once worked for a company with ties to the Shin family. The employment records stopped abruptly. 6 years ago. Do-hyun read that line 3 times. 6 years ago was not a random number in this house. 6 years ago was the year his older brother died, the year the trust dispute started, the year a newborn nephew had been left in a family that didn't know what to do with grief that specific, and a sister-in-law had vanished before anyone thought to ask her the right questions while she was still around to answer them. He closed the file. He didn't believe in coincidences. Not in this family, not ever. He didn't mention it to anyone. Not his grandmother, whose reaction in the ballroom had already told him this was bigger than one strange afternoon. Not heir, who had a way of turning any piece of information into leverage before he'd even decided what to do with it himself. He sat with it alone instead, the way he sat with most things, turning it over without letting it show on his face. The board meeting that afternoon didn't go any easier. "The vote is in 6 weeks, Hyrin reminded him, not for the first time, in the tone of someone repeating herself for the recording rather than for him. "If you walk in there unmarried, unattached, with nothing to show the board except spreadsheets, they will vote for delay, maybe worse. There are members of this board who have been waiting years for a reason to slow this down. Given this company 6 years of my life," Do-hyun said, "that should be enough." "It's never been about what's enough," his grandmother said quietly. "It's about what looks stable. You know this. You've always known this." Do-hyun said nothing. He was thinking about a woman humming a song without knowing why it mattered, and a boy who didn't take strangers' hands, and a single line in a background file he couldn't stop rereading. He was also thinking, uncomfortably, about the way she'd looked at him in that hallway, like his name meant nothing to her at all, like she was the only person in the building who hadn't already decided what she thought of him before he spoke. "Marry within the year," his grandmother said, "or announce an engagement before the vote." Either would satisfy the board. I'm not marrying a stranger to satisfy a board. Then find someone who isn't a stranger. He didn't answer that either. But something about the way she said it stayed with him longer than he wanted it to. That night, alone in his study, he pulled up the estate's security footage from the day before. Not for security reasons. He told himself that twice, which should have been the first sign he didn't believe it. He watched Jaewoo cross the ballroom floor and take Zuri's hand without hesitating, the boy who flinched from new nannies, who'd taken 8 months to warm up to his own physical therapist, who still slept with a hallway light on because the dark reminded him of things no one had ever fully explained to him. Do-hyun watched it twice. By the third time, an idea had already started forming in the back of his mind, one he wasn't proud of, one that felt less like strategy and more like an excuse dressed up as strategy, but he couldn't quite let it go either. A fake engagement solved the board's demand for stability. It also, conveniently, kept the one woman connected to his family's oldest unanswered question close enough to watch. He told himself that second part was practical. He didn't fully believe that either. He found her the next evening, after the event had wound down and most of the staff had gone home, sorting through the last of her equipment near the ballroom entrance. Have a proposal, he said. Zuri didn't look up from the box she was packing. I don't do proposals after midnight. It's 10, still no, 3 months, he said. You pretend to be my fiancé. Public appearances, family events, the succession vote. In exchange, I clear every debt your business currently has and fund your next 2 years of operating costs in full. That got her attention. She straightened slowly, box forgotten. Excuse me, my family needs to see stability before a succession vote. You need money you clearly don't have. I've seen the numbers, whether you meant for me to or not. It solves both problems. You want to buy me. I want to hire you. There's a difference from where I'm standing. Her voice had an edge now, sharper than the professional tone she'd kept all week. I don't know what you think I am, Mr. Shin, but I'm not a line item you can move around to make your board happy. That's not what I meant. It's exactly what you meant. You just don't like hearing it said back to you. She walked past him toward the door, and for a moment he thought that really was the end of it, that he'd misjudged her the same way he'd misjudged the whole idea. Think about it, he said to her back anyway. You don't have to answer tonight. She didn't answer that night. She sat with it for 2 days. She went back to her apartment and found herself standing in front of the boxes she'd never fully unpacked, her mother's things stacked exactly where they'd been for months. She didn't open them. She wasn't ready for that, and some part of her, the part that had spent years being careful about which griefs she let touch which decisions, suspected this shouldn't be one of them anyway. But the rent notice was still on the counter, unresolved. Her assistant called on the second day, gentle in a way that somehow made it worse, and asked carefully whether she should start looking for other work in case the studio didn't make it through the quarter. Zuri told her to give it 1 more week. She didn't tell her why. She called Do-hyun on the 3rd day before she'd fully decided what she was going to say when he picked up. I have conditions, she said, before he could speak. I was going to say the same thing. Met the following morning, in a conference room too formal for a conversation this personal, sitting across a table like 2 people negotiating something neither of them wanted to name honestly. No real relationship, Do-hyun said. This stays professional, regardless of what it looks like in public. No expectations beyond the arrangement. Agreed, obviously. Interfering in family matters. Whatever you see or hear inside that house, it isn't yours to comment on, question, or repeat. Fine. You don't ask about Jaewoo's parents. Not to him, not to anyone in this family, not once for any reason. Zuri paused at that one. It landed harder than the others, though she couldn't have said exactly why, some instinct in her recognizing weight before she understood its source. Understood, she said anyway. She didn't know yet that the question she'd just agreed never to ask was the one that would eventually undo everything between them. Moving into the estate felt less like an engagement and more like relocating to a country with entirely different laws. There were cars she wasn't allowed to question the cost of, security personnel who seemed to know her schedule before she did, a guest suite bigger than her entire apartment, with a closet already half filled with clothes chosen by someone she'd never met and would probably never meet, sized to her measurements without her ever having been asked for them. She learned quickly which staff members were kind to her because they meant it, an older housekeeper who left tea outside her door without being asked, and which were kind to her because they were being watched, their smiles arriving and leaving on a schedule that had nothing to do with her. Get used to it, Do-hyun told her the first night, with the flat certainty of someone who'd never actually had a choice about getting used to it himself. I don't think I want to get used to it, Zuri said. I think I just want to survive it. He looked at her like that was an answer he hadn't expected from anyone in this house in a long time. He didn't say anything else. The family's reaction to her arrival split cleanly down the middle. Some treated her with the careful, distant courtesy reserved for temporary things. A cousin twice removed who complimented her dress and then asked, pointedly, how long she expected this to last. Others watched her the way you watch something you haven't decided is a threat yet, waiting to see which way it would move. Hyrin was polite in the specific way that made politeness feel like a warning. You must be very talented, she said, at their first proper introduction, to catch Do-hyun's attention so quickly. He's usually much more careful. I design events for a living, Zuri said. I'm used to people underestimating how much work goes into making something look effortless. Hyrin smiled, and the smile didn't reach anywhere close to her eyes. How fitting, she said, and moved on before Zuri could decide whether that had been a compliment or something else entirely. Their first practice, appearing as a couple, happened at a small family dinner, 3 days after she moved in, stilted, over-rehearsed, Do-hyun's hand resting against the back of her chair, like a man following stage directions he hadn't fully memorized. Doing the thing where you look like you're solving a math problem, Zuri murmured, leaning toward him under the noise of the table. I don't know what that means. It means relax your jaw before your grandmother notices you're gritting your teeth through your own engagement dinner. He almost laughed, almost. He caught it before it fully arrived, but not before she saw it. Better, she said, and went back to her plate like she hadn't just won something. Their first real public appearance came a week later, a charity gala, cameras stationed at the entrance, a ballroom full of people who had clearly already decided what they thought of her before she'd said a single word to any of them. An investor cornered her near the bar partway through the evening, needling her with a pointed, condescending question about how someone finds her way into a family like the Shins, clearly designed to make her stumble in front of his colleagues. Zuri didn't stumble. She answered him with enough grace and enough edge that he laughed before he'd fully registered he'd been outmaneuvered, and by the time he walked away, 2 other people at the table were watching her with open curiosity instead of suspicion. Do-hyun, watching from across the room, went very still. He'd expected her to survive the night intact. He hadn't expected to be impressed. You handled that well, he said later, in the car, the city sliding past the windows in streaks of light. Spent 2 years managing rich people who think they're doing me a favor by hiring me, Zuri said. He wasn't the first, and he definitely won't be the last. Do-hyun almost smiled. You always this unimpressed by powerful people, only the ones who go looking for a reaction, Zuri said, glancing at him sideways. You should try not needing one so badly. He didn't have a ready response to that. For the rest of the ride, neither of them said much of anything, but it wasn't the same silence they'd started with a week ago. This one had a different shape to it, one neither of them was ready to name. Jae-woo stopped asking permission to want her around. He simply expected it. He wouldn't sit for dinner unless Zuri was beside him, scooting his chair closer with a kind of quiet insistence no one in the house seemed willing to argue with. He brought her drawings without being asked, a lopsided sketch of what she eventually realized was meant to be her, in a dress the color of the flowers she'd arranged the day they met. Once, when Do-hyun tried to read him a bedtime story, Jae-woo asked, without any cruelty in it, whether Zuri could do it instead. Do-hyun let her. He told himself it was easier that way. He didn't examine the sentence much further than that. He stood in the doorway one night and watched her finish the story, watched Jae-woo's breathing slow into sleep, watched her linger a few minutes longer than she needed to, smoothing the blanket without waking him. She fell asleep herself before she meant to, still sitting on the edge of the bed, her head tipped against the headboard. Do-hyun crossed the room quietly. He pulled a throw blanket over her shoulders, his hand paused near her hair. He stopped himself before it got there, straightening instead, telling himself the word arrangement like it still meant something solid. It didn't sound as convincing as it had a week ago. The next family dinner reminded him why he'd needed it too. You must find our world exhausting, Hyrin said to Zuri, pleasant as a blade wrapped in silk. So many rules, so many people watching. I imagine it's difficult coming from so little structure. Run a business, Zuri said. I understand structure fine. What I'm still learning is how much of yours is actually about protecting the family and how much is just about controlling who gets close to it. A small silence followed. Do-hyun's grandmother at the head of the table allowed the faintest curve of a smile. Hyrin's expression didn't change at all, which somehow made it worse. Soo-jin found her afterward on the terrace and sat down without being invited. That was either very brave or very stupid, Soo-jin said. Can it be both? Usually is in this house. Soo-jin studied her for a moment. She'll remember that. Hyrin doesn't forget people who talk back to her. Be careful, noted. I mean it, Soo-jin said, quieter now. This family doesn't fight fair when it feels threatened. I've watched it happen before. Zuri filed that away without knowing yet how soon she'd need it. The terrace became a habit after that, Do-hyun finding her there most nights. The city lit up below them, conversations that started about nothing and drifted somewhere neither of them planned. My mother used to hum while she cooked, Zuri told him one night, unprompted. That song your grandmother reacted to, I've been humming it my whole life, and I never once thought to ask where it came from. She died before I thought to ask a lot of things. I'm sorry, I used to think grief had a schedule, like eventually you'd finish it and move on to something else. She shrugged. It doesn't work like that, it just gets quieter. Do-hyun was quiet for a moment. I haven't let anyone close enough to hear about my brother in years, he admitted. Not really close. It's easier to manage a company than it is to explain why you're still angry at someone who's been dead 6 years. You angry at him? I don't know anymore. Some days it's him. Some days it's everyone who was supposed to protect Jae-woo and didn't. Zuri didn't press further. She'd learned, in this house, that some doors opened slowly or not at all. Their first public appearance after the gala drew photographers who caught something neither of them had staged, Do-hyun's hand at the small of her back, easy instead of practiced, Zuri laughing at something only he'd said. The photos ran the next morning, with captions speculating about a real romance behind the sudden engagement. Hyrin read the headline twice. She didn't say anything to Do-hyun about it. She made a different kind of note instead, the kind she'd learned over the years to keep to herself until it was useful. She began watching Zuri more closely after that, not with suspicion exactly, with calculation. Jae-woo asked her the question on an ordinary Tuesday apropos of nothing while she was helping him with a puzzle. Are you going to leave like the others? Zuri set down the puzzle piece in her hand. What others? He shrugged, the same shrug his uncle used, small and closed. People leave. I don't have plans to leave, Zuri said carefully, because a promise felt too big to make to a 6-year-old whose trust she wasn't sure she'd earned yet, and a lie felt worse. But if I ever did, I'd tell you first. I wouldn't just disappear. He considered that with the seriousness only children bring to conversations adults think are casual. Okay, he said, and went back to the puzzle like the matter was settled. Zuri sat with the weight of it long after he'd moved on. It was that same week she asked once carefully about Jae-woo's mother, not to Jae-woo but to Do-hyun over dinner, the question arriving before she'd fully decided to let it. Zuri started, then caught herself, remembering the rule, remembering the way it had landed the day she agreed to it. Never mind. Do-hyun's expression had already tightened. You know the rule. I know the rule. I just forgot for a second why it mattered so much to you. He didn't answer that. But something about the way he looked at her, not angry, just tired, like the question had touched a bruise he hadn't realized was still there, told her the rule wasn't really about protecting the family from her. It was about protecting himself from a wound he hadn't let close. A week later, a rainstorm caught them both at the far edge of the property. Inside the small guest house, Do-hyun sometimes used to escape the main house entirely. Neither of them had planned to be trapped there together. You could just admit you like arguing with me, Do-hyun said, watching rain streak down the window. It would save us both time. I don't argue with you, I correct you, there's a difference. There, you're doing the math problem jaw thing again. He almost laughed, and this time he didn't fully catch it before it arrived. The conversation slid, the way it did lately, from teasing into something heavier, his brother, her mother, the strange shape of a family neither of them had chosen the terms of. He admitted, quieter than he meant to, you make it difficult to remember why I wanted this arrangement in the first place. That's not an answer, I know. Space between them had closed without either of them tracking exactly when. For a moment, it looked like it might close all the way. Zuri pulled back first. We should get back before the roads flood, she said, voice not quite steady. Do-hyun didn't argue, but neither of them moved for a second longer than the moment required. Neither of them mentioned the guest house the next morning. Zuri kept to the far end of the breakfast table. Do-hyun buried himself in calls he didn't strictly need to make. It wasn't awkwardness, exactly. It was two people carefully avoiding a conversation neither felt ready to have, circling the same unspoken thing from opposite sides of a room. It didn't last. A few days later, Zuri offered to help catalog an old hallway cabinet the family had been meaning to sort for years, half out of boredom, half because staying busy kept her from thinking too hard about a man she wasn't supposed to be thinking about at all. Behind a stack of old ledgers, wedged where it had clearly sat undisturbed for years, she found a photograph. Two young women stood arm in arm, laughing at something outside the frame. One of them Zuri didn't recognize, elegant, dark-haired, unmistakably part of this family's world. The other one was her mother, younger than Zuri had ever seen her. Lighter somehow, in a way that didn't match the careful, quiet woman who'd raised her. Zuri's hands went still around the frame. Her mother had never once mentioned this family. Not this house, not these people, not a single word in 23 years about knowing anyone here at all. What are you doing? Do-hyun's voice, from the doorway, flatter than she'd heard it in days. She turned, photograph still in her hand, and watched his expression shift the moment he saw what she was holding. Where did you find that? The cabinet. I wasn't looking for anything, I was just. You weren't looking for anything, he repeated, the words sharper than they needed to be. You've been in my family's private records for 10 minutes and you weren't looking for anything. I didn't know my mother was in this photo until I opened it, Zuri said, her own voice rising to meet his. I didn't even know she knew this family. That's convenient. It's not convenient, it's the truth. Her voice had an edge in it now too. You think I planned this? You think I orchestrated a 6-year-old grabbing my hand on the first day I walked into this house? He didn't answer that. He just looked at her the way he had the very first day, like she was a problem he hadn't solved yet, a variable he couldn't account for. Something in Zuri's chest went cold. Put it back, she said quietly, and he didn't stop her from leaving. He also didn't apologize. It was Soo-jin who found her later, sitting alone on the terrace steps, arms wrapped around her knees. He's not usually like that, Soo-jin said, sitting beside her without asking. Suspicious of everyone, yes. Cruel about it, not usually. Thinks I'm investigating his family. I didn't even know there was anything to investigate. Soo-jin was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. 6 years ago, Do-hyun's older brother died, she said finally. Suddenly, his wife Jae-woo's mother disappeared not long after Jae-woo was born. No one really talks about it. There were problems with the inheritance even before that. Documents that got changed. Things that never quite added up. Zuri felt something tighten in her stomach. Changed how? Jae-woo was supposed to inherit a substantial share of his father's holdings when he turns 18. It ended up in a trust instead, one with terms nobody remembers agreeing to. Soo-jin shrugged, the gesture of someone who'd made peace with not understanding it years ago. This family doesn't talk about its ghosts. It just moves around them, very quietly, and expects everyone else to do the same. Zuri sat with that long after Soo-jin had gone back inside. Her mother had been photographed with Jae-woo's mother. Her mother's employment records ended exactly 6 years ago. The same year Jae-woo was born, the same year his mother vanished. She thought of the 4 years her own mother had once gone missing. The stretch of Zuri's early 20s when nobody, not even Zuri, knew where Evelyn had gone. She'd always believed it was one of her mother's private struggles, something to do with grief or debt or a relationship gone wrong. She had never once connected it to this house, to this family, to anything beyond her mother's own life. Until now, sitting there, she understood. The disappearance hadn't been personal. It had been fear. She didn't believe in coincidences either. Not anymore. She went home that weekend, her actual apartment, the one she'd barely lived in for weeks, and finally opened the boxes she'd been avoiding, old photographs, letters, a jewelry box with nothing valuable inside except what it meant to her. She found the false bottom by accident, prying at a seam she'd always assumed was just wear from age. Inside was a sealed envelope, yellowed at the edges, her mother's handwriting across the front, no name, just a single line, "For if I'm not here to explain it myself." Zuri didn't open it that night. She sat with it on her lap for nearly an hour, aware that whatever waited inside was going to change something, and not ready yet to find out what. She opened it the next morning, in the grey light before the sun was fully up, sitting cross-legged on her apartment floor surrounded by boxes she'd spent 2 years avoiding. One sentence, in her mother's careful handwriting, "If they ever discover the truth about the child, don't let them take him." Zuri read it 4 times before the shape of it fully settled into place. 6 years ago. A child. A family desperate enough to hide something about him, careful enough to bury the paper trail, powerful enough that her mother had felt the need to hide the warning inside a jewelry box rather than simply saying it out loud. There was only one child this could be about. She sat on the floor of her apartment, letter shaking slightly in her hand, and understood, for the first time since a 6-year-old had crossed a ballroom and taken her hand without explanation, exactly how deep this went. If you're enjoying Zuri and Do-hyun's story so far, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me what you think will happen next. She didn't get the chance to decide what to do with the letter on her own terms. Do-hyun found it first, in her bag, during a search he told himself was for the family's protection, and would later admit, privately, was really about his own fear finally catching up to him. He read it standing in her guest suite, and by the time she walked in and saw him holding it, his face had already closed like a door slamming somewhere down a long hallway. "You knew," he said. "This whole time. I found that 2 days ago. I didn't know any of this existed before then. You expect me to believe that. I expect you to believe me because I haven't lied to you once since I walked into this house." Her voice shook now, not from fear, but from something closer to grief. "You asked me to pretend to love you. I never expected you to make me regret actually starting to." Something moved behind his eyes, pain, maybe, or the first flicker of doubt, but pride got there first, and pride was louder. "Arrangement is over," he said. Jae-woo cried when she left. Not loudly, he wasn't a loud child, but steadily, holding onto her coat sleeve until a member of staff gently peeled his small fingers away, his face doing the thing children's faces do when they're trying very hard not to fall apart in front of adults who are already disappointing them. "Why did you make her leave?" he asked Do-hyun afterward, in the flat, devastating way only children manage, no anger in it yet, just confusion, which was somehow worse. Do-hyun didn't have an answer he was willing to say out loud. He watched Zuri's car disappear past the gates and told himself the tightness in his chest was relief. It wasn't. He discovered that the next morning, breakfast was late because the kitchen delivery had arrived at the wrong time, and there was no Zuri standing quietly at the edge of the room reorganizing the staff before the problem became visible. Jae-woo pushed his plate away. "Syrup is wrong." A member of staff immediately offered to replace it. "It doesn't matter," Jae-woo muttered. Do-hyun looked at the plate. He knew what was wrong. Zuri had somehow learned, without making a point of it, that Jae-woo hated the syrup that came with the breakfast service. She had started asking for a different one without anyone realizing she'd been paying attention. Now she wasn't there. Later that morning, Do-hyun walked through the entrance hall and stopped. The flowers had been replaced. They were beautiful. Perfectly arranged, expensive, and completely wrong. Zuri had always left one small imperfection in her arrangements, a branch angled slightly away from the rest, a flower placed where no formal designer would have thought to put it. She used to say perfection made a room feel artificial. Now the arrangement was flawless. Do-hyun stared at it longer than he meant to. Nobody else seemed to notice. He did, at lunch. He found himself looking toward the terrace before remembering she wasn't there. Irritated him enough that he returned to his office, but even there he couldn't concentrate. His eyes kept drifting toward the empty chair across from his desk, the one Zuri had occupied during the afternoons. She'd brought him documents, challenged his decisions, or simply sat there while working on her own designs. Nothing was wrong with the house. That was what bothered him. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. The staff were working. The estate was quiet. Jae-woo was being looked after. The flowers were perfect. The schedule was running on time. And somehow, the entire place felt wrong. Do-hyun stood in the hallway that evening, staring toward the ballroom where Zuri had first met Jae-woo. She hadn't been there long enough to belong to this house. Yet somehow, she'd changed its rhythm without anyone realizing it. She had made herself useful without demanding attention. She had filled spaces without trying to own them. She had become part of the daily life of the estate so quietly that he hadn't understood how much she'd changed until she was gone. Do-hyun finally admitted the thought he'd been avoiding since the moment her car disappeared. He didn't miss the arrangement. He didn't miss the contract. He didn't even miss having someone around to challenge him. He missed her. The realization unsettled him more than any accusation Zuri had ever made. Because if he missed her, then the question he couldn't escape was much worse. What if he'd just driven away the one person he'd actually wanted to stay? And for the first time, Do-hyun understood that whatever he felt for Zuri had stopped being something he could explain away as convenience. He had fallen for her. He simply hadn't realized it until she was gone. Hyrin heard about the letter within a day. She always heard things within a day. It was, Soo-jin had once said dryly, practically a superpower. She'd spent 6 years making sure nothing ever surfaced from that period. moving pieces quietly, patiently, the way you tend a garden you don't want anyone to notice you're tending. She wasn't about to let a struggling event designer with a sad family history undo 6 years of careful work now, not with the vote weeks away. She made a call to someone she hadn't spoken to in years, a man who'd helped her once before, quietly, expensively, and who owed her enough silence to help her again. She has to be discredited, Hyrin said, voice even, unhurried. Before the vote, whatever it takes. By the end of the week, documents had appeared in a storage unit Zuri had once used for her business. Documents suggesting she deliberately courted Do-hyun's trust to gain access to Shin family finances, complete with fabricated correspondence and altered dates designed to look damning at a glance. They were convincing. They were also completely false. Do-hyun received them anonymously, in an envelope with no return address, delivered to his office with unsettling precision. He read them standing alone, and felt something in his chest cave in the way it hadn't since his brother died. He believed them. For almost a full day, he believed them. Then, late that night, alone with a glass of scotch he hadn't touched, he read them again. Something about the dates didn't sit right. A signature that looked almost right, but not quite, the pressure of the pen slightly wrong, the way a forgery always is if you know what you're looking for. A financial trail that led somewhere too convenient to be an accident. He'd spent his whole career reading contracts for exactly this kind of flaw. He'd built a company on noticing the details other people missed. He just hadn't expected to find one aimed at the woman he'd already convinced himself had betrayed him. He didn't sleep that night. Zuri, for her part, hadn't run. She'd gone back to her mother's letter, back to the name of an old company mentioned in passing in one of Evelyn's other papers. A name she'd almost overlooked the first time, tucked into a margin note like an afterthought, and started pulling threads she probably should have left alone. It led her 3 days later to a retired lawyer living 2 hours outside Seoul, in a small house with a garden he clearly spent more time on than he'd ever spent on his old career. He looked at her the moment she said her mother's name like he'd been waiting 6 years for someone to finally ask him the right questions. "Your mother came to me," he said, settling into a chair across from her, "not long after the boy was born. She'd found something in the trust documents that didn't match what she'd been told to file. She wanted to expose it. She was insistent about it, actually, more insistent than was probably safe. What happened to her? She disappeared before she could hand over the original." His hands, folded on the table between them, tightened slightly. "For 4 years, no one knew where she'd gone. It wasn't until she resurfaced, quietly worn down by everything she'd been running from, that I heard from her again, and only a short while after that she was gone for good." "Never told me any of it," Zuri said, quiet. "She wouldn't have wanted to frighten you," the lawyer said gently. "I think she spent the rest of her life trying to protect you from exactly this conversation." He rose slowly and returned with a worn folder. He gave her the document. It was the original inheritance agreement, the real one, unaltered, proving Jaiwoo had always been legally entitled to his full share of his father's holdings. The signature on the version the family had used for years was forged. Cleanly, expertly forged, but forged all the same. Do-hyun found his own answer around the same time, tracing the shell company behind the fabricated evidence back through 3 deliberately confusing layers of paperwork, each one designed to make the trail go cold. It wasn't untraceable enough. Not for him. It led to Hyrin. He sat with that for a long time in his darkened office, replaying every conversation he'd had with Zuri since the day she'd walked into the ballroom. The photograph she genuinely hadn't understood, the letter she'd been afraid to even open, the money she'd never once tried to take more of than the contract strictly allowed, the way she'd looked at him in that guest house like she had nothing left to hide. She hadn't come into his family to destroy it. She'd come to find out what had already destroyed hers. He picked up his phone to call her. He set it back down without dialing. Some apologies, he realized, weren't meant to happen over the phone. The succession ceremony was exactly as large as these things always were. Board members in careful rows, executives murmuring in low voices, press kept at a respectful distance behind a velvet rope. His grandmother seated exactly where she always sat, watching everything with the stillness of someone who'd sat through decades of these rooms. Do-hyun stood at the head of the table with a pen in his hand and papers in front of him that would decide the next decade of his family's future. Hyrin watched him from across the room with the particular calm of someone who believed she'd already won, her expression composed, unbothered, the picture of a woman with nothing left to fear. He hesitated with the pen above the signature line, distracted, unsettled, searching the room for something he couldn't quite name. Then the doors opened. Every head in the room turned. Zuri walked in holding an old envelope, the same one that had sat in a locked drawer for 6 years, waiting for someone brave enough to bring it back into this house. "Before you sign that," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room, "you need to know what your family did 6 years ago." Do-hyun set the pen down slowly. "Zuri, let her speak," his grandmother said, quiet and sure, and the whole room seemed to exhale at once. Zuri laid the documents on the table in front of the board, hands steady despite everything. She explained the forged signature, the shell company, the trust terms altered before Jaiwoo's father had even finished grieving his own wedding, before the ink on the original agreement was fully dry. Hyrin denied it, calmly at first, her composure a well-practiced thing. "This is absurd," she said. "I would never." "You already did," Do-hyun said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room more effectively than shouting would have. "I traced it myself, 3 days ago. The shell company, the transfers, all of it." Hyrin's composure cracked, just slightly at the edges. Zuri produced the financial trail next, the transfers, the dates, the account numbers linking the shell company directly back to Hyrin's own control, laid out with the same precision she used to plan a room down to the last flower. The room went still in a different way now, the kind of silence that has weight to it. "You have no idea what it took," Hyrin said finally, quieter now, something almost desperate leaking into her voice. "To hold this family together, to make the hard decisions no one else was willing to make." "You didn't hold this family together," Do-hyun said. "You held a 6-year-old's inheritance hostage and let the rest of us grieve around the hole you made." Security moved toward the doors, not to remove Zuri, but at Do-hyun's quiet signal, to make sure no one else left the room. By the time it was over, there was no version of events left standing except the true one. Jaiwoo's inheritance, the one quietly stolen from him before he was even old enough to know it existed, was restored in full, on record, in front of every person whose signature had once helped bury it. Do-hyun found Zuri afterward, away from the noise, in a quiet hallway that suddenly felt very far from the boardroom. "I was wrong," he said, no qualifiers, no excuses built in to soften it. "I believed everyone in my life wanted something from me. I never once considered that someone could risk everything to protect me instead." Zuri didn't answer right away. "You didn't just doubt me," she said finally. "You made me leave. Let Jaiwoo watch me go without an explanation, because it was easier than trusting me when it mattered most. I know. I need you to actually know that, not just say it because the room's finally quiet enough to hear you." He nodded, slow and certain in a way she hadn't seen from him before, none of the guarded control from that first day in the ballroom. "I know," he said again, and this time it sounded like he meant it all the way through. She still didn't forgive him, not in that hallway. But something in her had softened enough to stay and hear the rest. "I don't want your money," Zuri told him, once the ceremony's noise had finally faded from the house and they were alone again. "I don't want your company, and I don't want to become another woman this family quietly controls behind closed doors. I'm not offering you either of those things." "Then what are you offering?" He didn't answer with words. A week later, he handed her a set of keys, not to a car, not to another wing of the estate, but to a building downtown with good light and better bones, exactly the kind of space she'd once described to him, half-joking, late one night on the terrace, as the studio she'd build if money were never a problem. "It's yours," he said. "No conditions. If you never speak to me again after this, it's still yours." Zuri turned the keys over in her hand for a long moment, testing the weight of them. "That's a big gesture for a man who isn't trying to buy me." "I already tried buying you," Do-hyun said. "It didn't work. This is just mine, to give you something that's actually yours. No arrangement attached." Jaiwoo found her before she left the estate that day, running the length of the hallway in a way the staff usually discouraged, small shoes skidding slightly on the marble. "Are you coming back?" he asked, breathless, holding onto her hand like he had the very first day. Zuri looked at Do-hyun. "Only if she wants to," he said. Zuri knelt down to Jaiwoo's height, steadying his hand in hers. "I think I want to," she said. "If that's all right with you." He nodded so hard it looked like it hurt, and for a moment, the seriousness that always sat behind his eyes gave way to something closer to an ordinary 6-year-old's relief. That night on the same terrace, where they'd first started talking like two people instead of two strangers bound by a contract, Do-hyun said the thing he'd been circling for weeks. I spent my whole life believing love was a weakness, something powerful people couldn't afford to carry. Now I think I was just afraid of finding the one person who'd make that true. He looked at her the way he hadn't let himself look at anyone in years, no calculation in it, nothing held back. You're not my weakness, Zuri. You're the reason I finally know what I'm fighting for. She didn't have a clever answer for that one. She kissed him instead. Months later, her studio was fully open, full light, real bones, the kind of work she'd always wanted to build her name on, her own name on the door this time instead of borrowed prestige. Do-hyun had softened in ways his board still hadn't quite adjusted to. Though they'd stopped commenting on it out loud, Jaewoo had started sleeping through the night again. Hallway light finally left off more nights than not, and asked, more than once, when Zuri was going to be around for good. Like it was a simple question with a simple answer. There was no more contract between them, no arrangement, no rules written down to keep either of them safe from the other. Just a wedding being planned, slowly, the way things are planned when nobody's in a hurry anymore. Because for the first time in either of their lives, there was nothing left to prove to anyone but themselves. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Afro K Storyverse, like the video, and comment your favorite moment W.